Good afternoon and welcome to the Workforce Observer, where we go beyond the headlines to explore the real forces reshaping work, talent, tech, and the business of staffing. We are very pleased to have with us today Janette Levey, an employment attorney focused on protecting employers and mitigating risk. She also helps enhance workplace culture through strategic employer-employee relations. Welcome, Janette.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, there's a lot going on. So, can you provide like an overview of the current legal landscape impacting the staffing industry, including buyers of, staffing services?
Oh, so you want that in what, 10 words or less?
Well, let's look at the top,
Nine.
maybe top two or three things, just like an
Well,
overview.
I
Then we can dive into deeper stuff.
well, what I would say is pretty much what is impacting other employers certainly impacts the staffing industry, perhaps a little more so. I always say a staffing firm is kind of a mega employer because usually the staffing firm has more of them. There's more moving parts.
Right.
So, I mean, we're seeing a lot on issues regarding employee leave, a lot on pregnancy rights. We're seeing also now the EEOC is zeroing in on religion in the workplace and, an employee's religious practices, and accommodations of that as well. Then, of course, there's, coming out of Washington, we're getting, I'm going to say in some way, maybe either mixed messages or really messages that seem unclear about DEI.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's that whole thing about it's illegal. No, it's not illegal, but I think, well, my own opinion on that one is that DEI, when it is misused, is illegal. And I think what really the president and his administration are really talking about is when it's misused, when it's okay, we're going to use DEI selectively, we're going to use it for some groups, but not others.
Can you give me
And
an example of this without going into any names? Obviously, I understand you have to protect your clients, but or not even not clients. Like, what do you mean by misuse? Just, I think it'd be interesting to know.
no, it's a good question. So I remember even last year there was at least one case where there was, in the name of DEI, an employer was taking some measures that were there to help the Black African American community to the detriment. There were sometimes where there were a lot of workers that identified as Caucasian that felt that they were actually being discriminated against because they were Caucasian. And so, to the extent that some of the programs can support that sort of argument, that would be illegal because that too is discrimination. And I don't like to use the word reverse discrimination because discrimination is discrimination. If you are, if an employer is discriminating based on race, it doesn't matter if I'm an employer and I'm discriminating against somebody because they're white or I perceive they're white or because they're black or because they're Asian or Latino or whatever. And that to me is where DEI is sort of misused. If you're saying that it only applies to some protected groups, well, that's not really DEI then. And that would be illegal because it's discrimination.
So how do I phrase this? So you're saying the administration is watching for making sure that people are treated fairly in the workplace? Or is that a
Well, okay,
stretch?
I am not in the minds of the people in the Trump administration or any administration.
Okay.
I'm what I'm saying is, and I'm just saying what it looks like to me
Okay.
is that the administration, that this is what they saw and then said DEI is illegal across the board. And
I
it
see.
isn't illegal across the board. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, if it's done right, furthers the goals of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, furthers the goals of, corresponding state laws.
Right. Okay.
So, and I think that what happened is it got painted with an overly broad brush.
Okay. All right. That's
So
great.
that's to me, that's just what it looks like to me. Now, does that mean that there could be more to that and there could be somebody that could point out something else to me and say, well, yeah, okay, but there's this and this suggests that it's not that, it's something else. I say, okay. Yeah, I would listen to it. But that's just at least that's what it seemed like, that's what it felt like to me. And so I do not necessarily think that that all employers should get rid of DEI programs. And now, how does this affect the staffing industry? So a staffing agency, all right, the staffing agency knows it can't discriminate on the basis of, all the protected classes, race, creed, color, sex, religion, disability, even we get to military status. And when we talk about sex, yes, that means sexual orientation and gender identity.
Right. Ageism, age.
Age,
Yeah.
yes,
Age. Yeah.
yes, absolutely, because that definitely happens too.
Right.
So when it comes to a staffing firm, though, what a lot of staffing firms will get wrong is they'll say, well, okay, a client told me that they only want men for this position, or they only want people who, whatever, are under a certain age. And the staffing firm then says, well, we're not discriminating, but this is their request and we have to fulfill the client's request. Oh, no, 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 no. That is discrimination. That is illegal. If you can't do it directly, you can't do it on behalf of someone else. And the reverse is also true. When the client of the staffing firm says, well, we're not discriminating because, it's the staffing firm that's actually screening them out. No, 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 no. If they are following your orders, if they're doing what you've asked, then that's what's known as joint employment, joint liability. So, and that gets into the concept of joint employment.
Yeah. That was my next question,
I
actually.
figured.
It's perfect. Okay. Good segue. So, joint
Yeah.
employment. Okay.
So, joint employment occurs when there is more than one person or entity that can have employer responsibilities toward one or more employees. And that staffing firm client relationship is usually a prime example of that. So if I have a business and I want to temporarily augment my workforce and I use a staffing agency, so both the staffing firm and my company are employers of any employees that the staffing firm provides my company. The staffing firm will appear to be the employer of record, meaning that usually they're W-2 employees, and on the W-2, it's the staffing firm that's going to show up as the employer. And the staffing firm will usually do a lot of the administrative stuff like the pre-employment screening, the I-9s, and maybe even some of the scheduling and other things.
Right.
But usually the client, when they get these workers, the workers usually come onto the client's premises and they're usually working under the client's supervision, direction, and control.
Right.
And the client usually is controlling the work conditions. So that's why you will have that's joint employment. There's another twist to that, though, when it comes to workers' compensation insurance.
Okay.
So, and that's actually where the client will want to be a joint employer. And that's because if it's not joint employment, if the client says, no, we're not joint employers and we're not an employer, well, then what happens when that contingent worker gets injured on your premises? So if the client is what would be known as the special employer, that client can kind of latch on to the staffing firm's workers' comp coverage, and then it's protected by the workers' comp bar.
I guess
Meaning,
that's why co-employment for different reasons was such a thing. I don't know. Is it still a thing? For
sure.
inst- Okay.
Well, as long as you have staffing firms, and there's also, I'll get to in the PEO model, there's also some co-employment there too.
Okay.
But
Talk to me a little about what's happening with co-employment in today's administration. Is there anything different, or I mean, what are the biggest, I guess, things you're watching around co-employment? Maybe it's
I
still the
mean,
same.
I'm not seeing a lot different on that, and for whatever reason, I could be wrong, but that does not appear to be on the Trump administration's radar.
Okay.
they haven't found a reason for it to be really. Although I could see one area where where it very well might be, and that would be with the issue of unionization and the NLRB. So the National Labor Relations Board, for those listening who are a little new to this wonderful wide world, the National Labor Relations Board enforces the National Labor Relations Act, which applies to really just about all private employers, not just those with union shops.
I see. Okay.
So the real question that comes up is if employees want to organize a union, and if those who are trying to organize the union want to get those contingent workers in as union members too. So then you get into, well, are they, is that client company and the staffing firm, are they a joint employer? And so, of course, the NLRB is going to argue that there's joint employment. And they're going to argue for a test that makes it easier for that staffing employee to be considered a joint employee of the staffing firm and the client company. And when you have a board that is composed of appointees by, say, in this case, a Republican president, they're less likely to find joint employment there because they're not exactly as sympathetic to organized labor. So I would be expecting that would be the first place that would come up, maybe the only place, because I don't know if that would matter as much, otherwise outside of the unionization context. It may not matter as much, but this is one area where I would expect it would. And as we get further in, when we get some more Trump appointees, we'll see. That's when you see the shift.
Right.
And then depending on who's in the White House after President Trump is done with his term, it could swing back.
Got it. Okay.
And be a more activist board.
Okay. I mean, we have to mention it. It's not something we can't not talk about. What should staffing firms and buyers watch for regarding I-9 compliance and immigration laws? And I mean,
Okay.
there's a whole H-1Bs as well, but we'll go step by step.
So the staffing firm is usually the entity that is going to be responsible for I-9, or primarily responsible for I-9 compliance.
Okay.
Now, at least in theory, ICE doesn't care about the contract between the staffing firm and the client. So ICE at different times, that's Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and that's the enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. As far as they're concerned, just like also when you have a Department of Labor, like a wage and hour issue, it may be, hey, okay, you work that out between the two of you, whatever your contract is, but you're both employers and we're going to go after whoever. They'll, in that instance with wage and hour, they may go after whoever's the deeper pocket. So in this case, I'm sorry if that sounds very cynical, but there it is. So
Today's reality.
I think that's just always been a reality. It's where the money is, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
In
So,
business. Okay.
but with the I-9s, as a practical matter, because it's the staffing firm that's usually handling the I-9s, actually, I'm thinking about that's an interesting question. It might be they'd go after the staffing firm, but then again, if they're conducting a raid, it's going to be on the premises where the alleged illegal immigrants are actually working.
Yeah, it's in the client side most times. I mean, not
Yeah.
the staffing
So
firm.
it depends, are we talking about an audit or are we talking about a raid? If we're talking about an audit, then their first point of contact is likely to be the staffing firm. If we're talking about a raid, then it might not be the staffing firm, it might be the client. Unless they're aware, well, the client is probably going to let them know that there's a staffing firm involved. And, then it gets very interesting to see what ICE does, and, it may depend on how experienced the ICE agents are.
Okay. Employee leave.
Yes.
What are the critical considerations for managing employee leave, particularly for contingent workers?
So when you're dealing with a contingent worker, again, what you've really got here is you've got an extra layer, because you've got the staffing firm, and they of course have to allow, let's assume for the moment that the employee is in fact eligible for leave, then they have to be granted leave. So then the question, it really has to do with the answer, or the issues tend to revolve around reinstatement. So you often have the client who will say, okay, you gave us this replacement, we want this replacement, we don't want to take this other person back. So then what gets interesting is, well, okay, this employee, the baseline is that the employee is entitled to reinstatement. It's, FMLA provides job protection. So now, let's say that the temp assignment ended before the employee came back. The project's over. Then the employee does not have to be reinstated to that particular job. You then get questions of, well, okay, but maybe the staffing firm still needs to try and place that employee somewhere comparable. So that can be a thing, as we say, that with I don't know if my kids will say, was that a thing? That's not a thing. So that could be a thing.
Right.
So, so that's one instance where when you're talking about staffing, a contingent worker, that's often an issue that comes up. Or again, let's say the assignment isn't over, and now the client doesn't want to take this particular, the employee who's out on leave doesn't want to take it back. And it may be very well a situation where the staffing firm has to say, we have to bring her back. So we're glad you like the replacement, because that means we did a good job giving you a good replacement. But this person has a right to job protection. And so that person's coming back. And a lot of that can be managed by, well, dare I say this, communicating well and being transparent from the beginning, which you'd think would be a very obvious thing, and how hard is that? But apparently, I've seen it time and again, apparently for many it's not as easy as we think it should be. And they just don't think about it.
I understand. You mentioned a bunch of issues, right?
Yeah.
So before we get to those, like, pregnancy, leave, religion, before we get to those, just given what you've told me, what are the common mistakes the staffing firms are making in this environment? Would you be able to group it like that? And then we can talk about, the issues, I guess.
Well, one I mentioned, which had to do with, discrimination issues.
Right.
The assumption that if I'm adhering to a client's request, now I'm not discriminating, and that's not necessarily true. That's a very big one.
Right.
The I-9s, I would say the mistakes that staffing firms make may not really be that different from the mistakes that many employers make. The I-9 conceptually is a simple form, but it's a very easy one to get wrong.
Right.
Although actually, one thing that I think might be more common, I think is more common in the staffing industry, has to do with remote verification.
Okay.
Because a lot of staffing firms will operate out of, they have an office in one location, but they may be hiring contingent workers from different locations that are far away.
Right.
And so what staffing firms had been doing, for a while, they were doing a form of remote verification when it was like, no, you're not allowed to do that. Where they would have them, show us your passport on video, or fax in a copy, or scan, or whatever. And that, okay, the general rule, and this is where we start, of course, the baseline, is that the documents have to be viewed in person. So in other words, let's say I'm the employer and I am completing Section 2 of the I-9 on behalf of the employer. That means I have to be the one who views the documents. I actually am supposed to be able to hold them in my hand. So that's in-person verification. So video, I'll get to the exception in a moment, but video, nope. Or, a photocopy or a fax, no, not allowed to do that. So now they're saying, well, wait a minute. We're hearing that video is okay under one specific circumstance, and that is if the employer is a participant, an e-verified participant in good standing. Okay. So in that case, yes, you can do it by live video, but only then. If the employer is not an e-verified participant in good standing, then you got to do it the good old-fashioned way.
All right. We have staffing firms who are small,
Yep.
sometimes just owner operator, small, and then you have ones which are huge and work with different clients. So how would you advocate that they work to make sure that they're not getting into hot water, and because things are changing fast? If you had to give any suggestions, what would it be? How do they work with external and internal counsel? Because many of the big firms are, they have internal counsel taking care of things, but not everybody's the size that they have that. So,
That's right.
so what would you recommend?
I would say, well, might want to consider, I mean, first, consider enrolling in E-Verify, because this way, if you in E-Verify, you're following the requirements, going forward, you do E-Verify for every employee, you do an I-9, then you do E-Verify, and you can do the video verification. So that's one way. And that might be, in the long run, the best and easiest way. So let's say you don't want to do that. Then you can appoint an agent to complete Section 2 on behalf of your company. Now, that said, you want to be careful about who that agent is. So when I'm doing trainings, I'll say, you can even have the employee's next door neighbor Dorothy, can be the agent for that employee, to verify that employee. But as nice as neighbor Dorothy may be, I don't recommend neighbor Dorothy, because neighbor Dorothy may not know what she's doing, and neighbor Dorothy's kind of harder to track down if something happens, et cetera, et cetera. So what some staffing firms do, if they are not enrolled in a Verify and don't want to, is they may reach out to another staffing firm that they're friendly with in the particular location, and maybe they help each other out. Hey, if you have people you're hiring in your area, or in my area, I'll verify them, and if I'm hiring people that are in your area, you'll verify, that sort of thing. So that's one way. Another way, and a lot of people get confused about this one too, is you can use a notary, but not in their capacity as notary. What do I mean by that? Notaries are easy to find. So you find the notary, but no, they are not notarizing the I-9. They're doing what anybody else would do. Looking at the documents, do they reasonably appear genuine and related to the person presenting them? Yes? Okay. Then what you do is you fill out the I-9, the Section 2 of the I-9 like anybody else would. And that's it. You're not notarizing. So a lot of notary associations push back because they think they're being asked to notarize, and they're not.
Right. You're
And
scrutinizing the documents, another
yeah,
eye on
yeah.
it. Okay.
But
Got it.
what I would recommend any employer, staffing firm or no, if you are using an agent, you're going to have remote verification, I would recommend have like a little instruction package. Could be a little step-by-step document, but also maybe even a little video,
Right.
little video clip, and maybe also a link, or whatever. Here's how you can get in touch with us, and we can walk you through it.
Besides I-9 and verification, what other recommendations would you have for staffing firms to work with counsel? Just, just general some best
In
practices.
general,
Yeah, in general. No particular issue.
okay, I would say that communication needs to be better. And I would say that there should be regular communication. Reach out to whoever your contact person is with the client and ask, how is it going with whoever it is, the assigned workers?
Okay.
Is there anything that's come up, anything that we should know about that you would like us to address? And also remind them that if you're getting into scheduling issues or say attendance or punctuality issues, remind them that they should bring those concerns to the staffing firm. And that's because even though they're joint employers, this will minimize the client's employer liability, their exposure.
Right.
Let the staffing firm, so basically the staffing firm should be saying to the clients, let us take care of those things. You can deal with everything else that's happening in terms of giving them direction as to what to do and when and where. But with respect to if they're late or they're not showing up, or even maybe there's some other issue with how that contingent worker is getting along with other people, on your premises, bring that back to us. So they should be clear about that, and maybe even just remind them, even if they're reminding them each week, even if they feel like, they're being hit over the head with it. Because I don't think that can be stressed enough. how is this person working out? Are there any issues with conduct? How is their performance? Are they showing up? Now, obviously, I think what you'd also want to do maybe is have something like some kind of shift report. When are they showing up? When are they leaving? That sort of thing.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
If I had to ask you, like I know you do talk about enhancing workplace culture, right? What
Yes.
what are employees feeling right now? Or just workers, what are they feeling right now? Besides uncertain, which we all are, I know.
Well, everybody's feeling uncertainty, and
Right.
I think some of it depends on the generation that you're dealing with.
Okay.
So if you have somebody, let's say, in the baby boomer age, or maybe even some Gen X, there may be a feeling of we're not valued because, we're being made to feel that we should be put out to pasture, that kind of thing. We're older than some of the other workers. So you'll have some of that. The Gen Z is interesting because there's a perception by some, and I don't think it's really correct at all or fair, that, oh, Gen Zers, they don't want to work. That's not true, in my opinion. I think what's true is that they don't necessarily feel as trusting of
The
people in
employer.
authority at the workplace.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting is it's not that they don't want to work, but they're not motivated in the same way as a what we call a boomer or a Gen Xer. And to some extent that may also be true of some of the millennials as well.
Yeah.
So a Gen Z and to some extent a millennial is willing or tends to show more willingness to trade off certain, like pay for perhaps more flexibility or for more input. So they're not necessarily, it's not that they don't care about money, but they're not motivated by it in the same way. They're not willing to be paid to accept rigidity or to accept not being heard.
Okay. As a lawyer, what would you say people should watch for? And I don't mean like personal stuff. I mean like like you had talked about employee leave, you had talked about religion, anything that employers should be looking out for, and workers too, in terms of any issues. Like, hey, keep an eye on this. I mean, you've given us some really interesting, I guess, feedback on DEI on
Yeah.
and stuff. So anything else that people should be like, okay, keep this in your radar. I mean, maybe nothing will happen, but
I would say that you really slow down before rushing to judgment. What do I mean by that? We're multicultural. So I'll actually give an example, like especially when there's a language issue as well. In a moment, I'll give an example of something that I actually saw. I came into,
okay,
encountered when I was in the staffing industry as in-house counsel. So you've got that, and again, the generational, but also you can have people that, there may be a disability involved that is influencing or that is behind a behavior that you may find to be problematic. And so you have to take into consideration that there may be more going on than what you're seeing on the surface. So one thing I would say is if you see a marked change in an employee's performance or behavior, take them aside discreetly and say, is everything okay? I've noticed the following. How can I help? And that can
okay,
go a long way.
that's good common sense, I think,
Yeah.
to do that.
Well, and by the way, I want to tell you, to me, that term to me is an oxymoron because it doesn't seem as common as we would like to think.
Oh dear.
But yes, I take your point. So that's one thing. Okay, the language. If you're dealing with people from a different culture and different language. So when one of our subsidiaries, when I was with this particular staffing firm, they had somebody, she was working on some assignment. It had to do with working with chemicals and stripping chemicals off certain equipment or furniture or whatever. And she came from, I don't remember which country, but it was a different country. She did speak English decently, but it was definitely not her first language. And there were definitely things that didn't translate the right way. So she's on this assignment and she was supposed to be stripping chemicals off something. And you do that in, I guess, this other room or the basement. And, kind of, I don't know if you want to say the slang or the shorthand, a lot of the people in the workplace would say, okay, here, I have to go, we're stripping. And then it was, okay, so and so, she was going to go and do this stripping of the chemicals. And they said, oh, so and so, she's going into such and such, we're into the basement. She's going to be going into the basement to strip. So next thing I knew, I'm getting a call. HR's getting a call, and HR's talking to me about this person's accusing these people of sexually harassing her.
Ah, because of the connotations of the words.
Because of the connotations. She was like, wait, what? That's what she thought. And what made it even worse is when I was trying to communicate with her, and she's emailing me, and she says, no, that's not what is. Try again. And that came across me. I did not like her tone. And I told her, because I didn't realize I was dealing with somebody who spoke a different language or whatever, and different culture. And at one point I said something like, please try to use a more civil tone. And she writes back and basically says to me, I don't know what that means. And that's when the light bulb went on. I said, oh, okay.
Okay.
And, and that also brings up another point, which is sometimes when you're getting email or text messages, you miss a lot from, you don't hear the person's tone, you don't see them, so you don't see expressions, and there's a lot of nuance that you can miss too.
Right. Well, I think that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. It went by so quickly.
Yeah, it did, right? Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it?
Thanks so much for your insights. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.